Hey crafters, thanks for joining me. Today we're going to make a fun fishing themed Father's Day card with a Swish N Pop pull tab. Hope you enjoy. So I started with a piece of paper that's 5 by 7 inches and I used my anti-static bag and I wanted to add some of the stamps from All the Clouds, the Lawn Fawn set. So I just put them roughly where I want them to be. And then I used my VersaFine ink to stamp the clouds. I didn't add my sun yet. I'll put it back on later. And I used a mixture of the large clouds and the medium clouds on this background. Now, once I'm happy with all the clouds, I'm going to use some white embossing powder and put this over the inked areas while it's still wet. And then I will heat them with my heat tool. And I like to use the Ranger heat tool over an embossing gun. So now I'm going to use some squeezed lemonade distress oxide and I will stamp my sun with this. And that way I won't have a black outline on my sun. And then I will use a couple of my Copic markers to color this in. So I'm going to use the Y13 and the Y15. And then I'll just blend these two colors together. So I want to protect my sun and my clouds when I apply some ink blending on the background. So starting with my clouds, I'm going to use a distress embossing pen and just fill in the area of the clouds. It doesn't have to be perfect. And then I'll use some white embossing powder on the cloud area while this ink is still wet. And on the sun, to protect that, I'm going to do exactly the same thing and use my distress embossing pen again. But instead of using the white embossing powder, I'm going to use some clear embossing powder. And this way I can use distress ink on the background and I don't need to cut out all the clouds and the sun. So I've gone ahead and put the embossing powder on all the images and I'll just heat set it with my heat tool. And once that's completely melted, I can start adding some background color. So I started with the Salvage Patina Distress ink. And I put this on the top half of my card. And then to add a little bit of a contrast, I used some Peacock Feathers Distress ink on the bottom. And the very bottom of my card, I didn't bother adding distress ink because this will be covered up with the mechanism. Now, as I mentioned before, it doesn't matter if your clouds are imperfect because I will show you a tip for fixing those. So once I'm happy with the blending of those two colors, I can do some die cutting. And I used the Lawn Fawn Swish N Pop pull tab set here. So I used the main piece that adds the holes on the bottom of my panel. And I just lined that up and ran it through my die cutting machine. And I also die cut two of the pull tabs, as you'll see there, and the mechanism, which is in clear acetate. So the first thing I did was I glued the two pull tabs together. I prefer if this is doubled up because I find it works a lot better. The cardstock that I use is alcohol ink friendly and it's 250 GSM, but I still think it's better to double up on this pull tab. So I'm just going to attach the pull tab to the mechanism and put it in the second hole, and you can see it moves beautifully there. Now, once you have the brads in place, it's important to test the mechanism a few times to make sure it's working. And then once you're happy with it, you can add some foam squares. So the ones I'm using are 2 millimeters high, and I've just cut them in half for the bottom of the card there, and I'm putting them in place and making sure they don't interfere with that mechanism. As this is a fishing themed card, I thought I would put a fish on the Swish N Pop pull tab. So I'm just deciding how far I want the fish to move up in the sky. I don't want him to touch the sun. So I use some of those foam tabs to limit where the fish will go. So once I'm happy with all of that, I can fix some of those clouds. And I found that using a paint marker works really well, and it fills in the areas that you might have missed with the white embossing powder. This is similar to a Posca pen, if you're familiar with them, like a painting pen. I also found that you can skip the embossing powder and just do the outline of the cloud and then fill them in with the paint pen as well. So this is the panel that will cover the mechanism on the front of the card. And right now it is 3 by 7 inches. And I use some Salty Ocean Distress ink on the top and then some chipped sapphire on the bottom of this. And I wanted to create a nice ocean or lake theme, which will be perfect for my Father's Day card. So the great thing about using distress inks or even distress oxides is that they will react with water. And the distress inks are really good at creating a base which you can stamp on. So that's why I picked the distress inks for this card. I wanted to stamp some little fish on this lake, and you'll see that later on. So I'm just blending the two colors together, and then I'll use my distress sprayer to add some texture to this lake. And once I'm happy with those little spots and I know that they're completely dry, I'll use a bit of that salvaged patina to emphasize the water drops. This will also help them look less white. So once I'm happy with that, I'm just going to add a little bit of a curve to the top of my lake here. I don't have a die that works, so I'm just going to use scissors. And I've trimmed off a little bit of the bottom as well, so that the highest point, it's about 2¼ inches deep by 7. And I'm just stamping some of my little fish with some chipped sapphire distress oxide. And I put the lily pad and the flower there just as a guide so I knew where my fish needed to be. Now I'm just going to add some water splashes around the lily pad and near where my fishing rod will be. Now these water splashes are in the Totally Awesome stamp set, and the fish are from the Very Happy Holidays set. Speaking of sets, so these are the stamps that I used from the Totally Awesome stamp set. And from the Dad Plus Me set, I used the fishing hat, the sentiment, and from Very Happy Holidays, I used the fishing rod, hook, and bucket of fish. And from Scooting By, I used the bunny image, which is perfect for that fishing rod. Now, I used one of the fish that I've already cut out here, and I'm just placing it on my mechanism to make sure it moves properly. And then I can adhere it on with a bit of double-sided tape and trim the mechanism. And once I'm happy with how the fish moves, I can start to put the card together. So I'm going to add on the bottom part of my lake here. And I will color in those fish before I adhere it down so that they're nice and orange and they peek through that lake. And I just used some Copics to do that. And Copics work really well on distress ink, whereas if you were to use them on distress oxide, they tend to get a little bit cloudy. So I'm just going to remove those foam tape covers and put this lake in place. And now I can put my images in place. Now I did forget to cut the hole for the pool tab on the right hand side of the lake. So I had to do this later on, but I would recommend that you do this before you add your images and before you put your cover on your pull tab mechanism. So I already colored and cut these images to give it a nice lake theme, and I'm really happy with the way the fish works. Now I'm just going to add a sentiment, and I wanted the fish to fly through the sentiment, so I just put foam tape on the left hand side of the sentiment. As you can see, there's a gap there, so that the fish would still be able to move. And when I put the sentiment on, I wanted to test it before I pushed it in place, just to make sure that the fish didn't get caught under the foam tabs. And once it's moving smoothly, I'll push it down and secure it into place. Perfect. Now in the Dad Plus Me set, there's a cute little dragonfly that I thought would look nice flying above the lake. So I used some cracked pistachio distress oxide and just stamped him a few times above the frog on the lily pad. And it just gives a nice little subtle effect on the background. Now that I'm happy with the background, I'm just going to trim my pull tab mechanism. So I'll put it at the shortest that it needs to be and trim it. And I've cut the little cover piece and colored it in with some chipped sapphire distress ink. And I'll just put that on top. And that way it matches the colors in my lake. And once I'm happy with that, I can add inside sentiment to my card. So there's some great Father's Day stamps on that same Dad Plus Me stamp set. So I used a few of those, as well as the image of the fishing hat for the inside of my 5 by 7 inch card. And I just adhered it, as you saw, with some glue, just being careful of the brad on the background. And I also added a cute little fish because I couldn't resist another one on the inside. And there you can see the working mechanism and the inside of the card. Thanks for watching, and I hope you found this video inspiring. Be sure to subscribe so that you're notified whenever I post a new video. Have a crafty day!